It is 3 o'clock in the morning.
The absolute worst time for this.
Right. It's 3 a.m. You are lying in bed. The house is completely quiet, and you are resting right on the edge of drifting off to sleep.
Just about to cross over.
Exactly. The day is done. Your brain waves are, finally slowing down. And then, completely without invitation, without any warning at all, and without any external trigger whatsoever, your neurological archives just forcefully eject a memory right into your conscious mind.
Out of nowhere.
Out of nowhere. You are suddenly 14 years old again. You are standing at the front of your classroom reading aloud, and you completely and utterly butcher the pronunciation of a very basic word.
Oh, that is brutal.
Or, maybe it's that time you enthusiastically waved back at someone across a crowded street, only to realize a devastating split second later that they were definitely not waving at you.
Yeah, they were looking right past you.
Right past you.
Right.
Or that time you confidently called your teacher Mom.
And the thing is, it never arrives as a gentle whisper either. It crashes into your awareness with the exact same payload of acute physiological distress as the day it actually happened. Sometimes decades ago.
Yeah, the physical reaction you have alone in that dark bedroom is incredibly visceral. You actually physically cringe in the bed.
You really do.
You feel your stomach drop. A highly localized flush of heat just creeps right up your neck and across your cheeks. You might even find yourself making this audible groan in the dark.
Like a literal verbal noise.
Yeah, and you get this overwhelming instinctual desire to grab the blanket and pull it completely over your face. You're hiding, even though you are literally the only human being in the room.
Which is such a bizarre behavior when you really think about it.
It is. And most paralyzing of all is this rock-solid, suffocating conviction that everyone who witnessed that micro-event all those years ago is still, to this very day, periodically thinking about what a massive fool you made of yourself.
Right, like they have a file on you. It is a universally agonizing experience. And in that moment at 3 a.m., it feels profoundly isolating. It feels as if your personal operating system is fundamentally broken, just tormenting you for absolutely no reason.
Just a glitch in the matrix.
But as we comb through the research today, what becomes immediately apparent is that this is not a glitch at all. This torment is actually a highly sophisticated defining feature of human neurobiology and evolutionary survival.
Which is exactly our mission for this deep dive. We have a massive stack of sources in front of us today. We've got neuroscience papers, evolutionary biology studies, cross-cultural psychology research.
A really broad spectrum of data.
A huge spectrum.
Yeah.
And we're going to use them to decode exactly why we are so thoroughly haunted by our most awkward moments. We're looking at the mechanical level of why these specific memories bypass our normal forgetting curves, why they literally cause us physical pain, and crucially, how we might actually be able to override that 3 a.m. alarm system.
Because you can override it.
You can. So, okay, let's unpack this. Because before we can really understand why our brain attacks us in the middle of the night, we have to precisely define the weapon it's using.
That's a great point.
We tend to throw terms like shame, guilt, humiliation, and embarrassment into the same conversational bucket, right?
Sure.
But in the clinical literature, they are vastly different experiences.
Oh, completely different. We really need to pull those concepts apart because the distinction explains the specific flavor of torture you feel. So let's look at the taxonomy of bad feelings, basically, these negative self-conscious emotions.
Okay, lay it out for us.
First, we have shame. Shame is characterized as a global, comprehensive, negative evaluation of the self. The internal architecture of shame broadcasts a single, very loud message, which is, I am fundamentally bad.
Wow, so it's deep.
It is deep and pervasive. It attacks your core identity, and it often stems from a perceived failure to live up to your own moral ideals.
Right, so it's an indictment of your character. It's very heavy and very internal.
Exactly. Then you have guilt. Guilt is much more localized and action-oriented, where shame is, I am bad. Guilt is, I did something bad.
I see.
And because guilt is focused on a specific behavior rather than your overarching identity, it actually offers a path to resolution. You can apologize, you can make restitution, you can fix the specific damage.
You can right the wrong.
Right. Now, humiliation, on the other hand, is essentially a degradation of your status forced upon you by a third party. It involves an antagonist. It's a public stripping of dignity that you do not believe you deserve.
Okay, so if shame is I am flawed, guilt is I caused harm, and humiliation is someone is attacking my dignity.
Exactly.
So what are the clinical parameters of embarrassment? Where does, dropping a cafeteria tray fit into this?
Well, embarrassment is uniquely interesting because it is a purely social emotion, strictly detached from moral weight. It is triggered exclusively by the sudden awareness that you have violated a social norm or script, and that this violation has been exposed to an audience.
Exposed to other people.
Right. The defining feature of embarrassment, distinguishing it from shame or guilt, is that it requires absolutely no moral transgression.
Okay, but let me challenge that definition for a second. If embarrassment requires an audience, if it's purely about social exposure, then why do I feel a flash of embarrassment, like that actual physical cringe, when I trip over my own feet in my kitchen when I am completely alone?
That happens all the time.
Right. There is no audience. The social exposure is zero. So shouldn't I just feel annoyed rather than embarrassed?
That is a brilliant pushback, and cognitive psychologists actually have a specific term for what you're experiencing there. It's called the internalized generalized other.
The internalized generalized other.
Yeah. Humans are such profoundly social creatures that we don't actually need physical people in the room to feel observed. From childhood, we internalize the collective gaze of society.
Like we build an audience in our head.
Exactly. Our default mode network, which is the brain network active when we're just resting and introspecting, is constantly running background simulations of social judgments. So when you trip in your empty kitchen, you trigger that internalized social monitor. Your brain instantaneously simulates how an audience would react if they were there, and it fires the embarrassment response anyway.
That is wild. So the invisible jury in my head convicts me before I even hit the floor.
They absolutely do.
And because it's a social violation rather than a moral one, I can't apologize my way out of it. If I steal someone's lunch, I can feel guilt, buy them a new lunch, apologize, and the guilt fades.
Right. The books are balanced.
But if my stomach violently rumbles during a moment of silence at a funeral, I haven't sinned, I haven't harmed anyone, but the internal alarm bells are just deafening.
The alarm bells are deafening because, to our nervous system, social exposure is one of the most severe threats imaginable. What's fascinating here is that for hundreds of thousands of years of human evolution, our physical survival was entirely dependent on remaining integrated within the tribe.
Because if you're out of the tribe, you're dead.
Exactly. Being perceived as odd, incompetent, or outside the norms meant risking ostracization. And ostracization meant death. You couldn't survive alone. So when you violate a social norm in public, your biological hardware interprets that not as a minor faux pas, but as an existential threat to your survival.
Which means we really need to talk about the hardware itself. Let's look at your brain on embarrassment. Because when we say an awkward memory hurts, the neuroimaging studies in our source material show that this is not a metaphor. This isn't poetry.
It is entirely literal. Functional MRI scans of people experiencing acute embarrassment reveal a highly specific, coordinated neural response. It usually begins in the medial prefrontal cortex, or MPFC.
The MPFC.
Right. This region is the hub of self-referential processing and social cognition. It's the part of your brain that allows you to imagine what other people are thinking about you.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So when the MPFC lights up during an embarrassing moment, it generates that hyper-focused, agonizing awareness of yourself as an object in other people's minds.
It's the mechanism that forces you to see yourself from the outside in. Suddenly, you are acutely aware of what your arms are doing, how your voice sounds, how much space you're taking up.
Precisely. You become a hyper-object to yourself. But the MTFC is just the surveillance system. The actual distress is generated a bit deeper in the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex, or DACC.
Okay, what does the DACC do?
This region acts as the brain's alarm bell for both error detection and social pain. And what the neuroimaging unequivocally demonstrates, which is just mind-blowing, is that the neural circuitry processing the social pain of embarrassment heavily overlaps with the circuitry that processes physical pain.
I really want to make sure we don't breeze past that. The brain uses the same pathways to process calling a colleague by the wrong name as it does to process a physical injury.
Yes. We need to be specific about the mechanism, though. If you break your arm, the somatosensory cortex tells you exactly where the physical damage is. Like, it's my left forearm. But it's the DACC that generates the subjective suffering, the ouch, the distress of the pain. When you experience intense embarrassment, there is no physical tissue damage, obviously, so the somatosensory cortex is quiet. But the DACC fires with the exact same intensity as if you were physically wounded.
That is unbelievable.
Your brain is literally flooding your system with the subjective distress of bodily injury because, evolutionary speaking, social damage was just as lethal as physical damage.
Your brain is literally screaming, we are injured, we are bleeding out socially.
Yes.
And that alarm must cascade down into the body, right? Because an embarrassing moment feels like a full-body event. You sweat, you shake.
That cascade is driven by the amygdala, which is the brain's primary threat detection center. The DACC signals a massive error, and the amygdala initiates a full-blown sympathetic nervous system response. It just floods your bloodstream with adrenaline and cortisol.
The classic fight or flight.
Exactly. Your heart rate spikes to pump blood to your muscles, your breathing becomes shallow, and your blood vessels dilate, which is what causes the physiological blush. You are being pushed into a full fight or flight state.
Over a mispronounced word.
Over a syllable.
You are physiologically prepared to outrun a saber-toothed tiger, but all you're trying to do is finish a PowerPoint presentation. That explains the sheer panic of the moment. But I want to understand the archiving process.
The memory aspect.
Yeah. Why does the 3 a.m. memory have such terrifying high-definition clarity? Most of us can't remember what we wore to work 3 days ago, but we can remember the exact texture of the carpet in the room where we embarrassed ourselves a decade ago.
To understand the hyper-retention of these memories, we have to look at how the amygdala interacts with the hippocampus.
Okay.
The hippocampus is the brain structure primarily responsible for converting short-term experiences into long-term declarative memories, like the filing clerk of the brain. During mundane daily activities, the hippocampus filters out the vast majority of sensory data. You don't need to remember Tuesday's commute, but when the amygdala is triggered by an embarrassing event, it releases a massive surge of noradrenaline directly into the hippocampus.
So it's basically chemically tagging the moment.
It alters the neuroplasticity of the brain in real time. This noradrenergic surge induces what neuroscientists call long-term potentiation. It rapidly strengthens the synaptic connections associated with that specific event.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, the amygdala is essentially stamping the memory with an unignorable chemical code that says, this data is critical for survival. Do not let it degrade. Store it with maximum sensory fidelity.
So the biological failsafe is prioritizing the data. But it feels like a terribly designed system. I mean, the brain isn't differentiating between a genuine life-threatening event and a totally harmless social fumble. It just measures the emotional intensity, assumes we almost died, and locks the memory in the vault forever.
It is a blunt instrument, for sure. It's better safe than, biologically speaking. And this storage priority is compounded by another cognitive mechanism known as the self-reference effect.
What is that?
Memory encoding is highly biased. Information that is processed in relation to the self is encoded deeper and retrieved with far less effort than information related to other people or abstract concepts. Because an embarrassing moment is, by definition, an event where you are the focal point of a perceived audience, the memory receives the highest possible tier of cognitive processing.
Which brings us to the ultimate cognitive distortion at the center of all this. The brain permanently stores these high-definition memories because the MPFC is screaming that a massive, highly attentive audience was judging you.
Right.
But when we look at the psychological data from the sources, we uncover a massive gap between our perception and reality.
Huge gap. This is where we shift from neuroscience to cognitive psychology. We have to examine whether our internal alarm system is actually tracking reality.
And spoiler alert, it absolutely is not. The sources detail a classic phenomenon called the spotlight effect. And to explain how this works, we need to talk about a brilliant piece of research conducted at Cornell University by Thomas Gilovich. The methodology of this study perfectly isolates the paranoia of embarrassment.
The design was elegantly cruel, honestly.
He really was.
They recruited college students and forced the designated test subject to put on a deeply embarrassing, highly conspicuous T-shirt. The shirt featured a massive, unflattering portrait of a polarizing celebrity, specifically Barry Manilow.
And for late 90s college students, wearing a Barry Manilow shirt was deemed the ultimate social faux pas.
Absolute social death.
So the participant has to wear this mortifying neon sign of a shirt, and they're instructed to walk into a small classroom where a group of their peers are already seated, quietly filling out questionnaires. The participant has to walk to the front of the room, sit down, wait a few moments, and then they are escorted back out. It's a pure, concentrated dose of social exposure.
And after leaving the room, the researchers asked the participant a simple question. They said, what percentage of the people in that room do you think noticed the person on your shirt?
And because of that MPFC activation we just talked about, because of the self-reference effect,
Yeah.
the participants were absolutely convinced they were the center of the universe. They estimated, on average, that roughly 50% of the room was staring at their shirt.
Half the room.
Yeah, they felt this intense theatrical spotlight tracking their every movement. But the researchers didn't just ask the participant. They went back and tested the observers in the room. They asked them who was on the shirt of the person who just walked in.
And the gap between the two numbers is the core of the spotlight effect. If we connect this to the bigger picture, the actual number of observers who noticed and could identify the shirt was barely 25%.
The participants overestimated their visibility by double.
By double.
But why does our brain fail so spectacularly at judging the room? If we are such highly attuned social creatures, why can't we accurately gauge how much people are paying attention to us?
The mechanism driving this failure is called egocentric anchoring. When we try to evaluate how others perceive us, we don't start from a neutral baseline. We anchor our estimation in our own intense subjective experience.
So we project our own panic.
Exactly. Because you are hyper-aware of your own awkwardness, you use that hyper-awareness as the starting point, and then you try to adjust downward to account for other people's perspectives.
But we don't adjust far enough.
We rarely adjust far enough. We fail to account for the cognitive load of the observers. You assume everyone in the room has the cognitive bandwidth to process your social stumble. What you fail to realize is that everyone else in that room is anchored in their own egocentric reality.
Oh, that makes so much sense.
They are worrying about how their hair looks, stressing about an upcoming meeting, or replaying their own 3 a.m. memories. Their cognitive bandwidth for processing your embarrassment is incredibly low.
This highlights a profound asymmetry in human memory. Let's go back to the memory of calling to teacher mom.
A classic.
Right. For you, the person who made the error, that event triggered a massive noradrenaline dump. The memory was encoded deeply as a vital survival metric. But for the teacher or the kid sitting next to you, it wasn't self-referential.
No, not at all.
Their amygdala didn't fire. It was just a low-stakes, vaguely amusing thing that happened in their peripheral vision.
Exactly. Because it wasn't emotionally tagged for them, their hippocampus discarded the data almost immediately. The event that you still wince about a decade later evaporated from their working memory within hours, if not minutes.
That should be incredibly liberating for anyone listening to this. Your emotional reality in that moment, the racing heart, the DACC pain, that was biologically real. But the social reality, the assumption that the audience permanently recorded your failure, is a total neurological hallucination. The audience was never really watching, and they certainly didn't take notes.
It is liberating, but it presents evolutionary biologists with a glaring puzzle. Well, if our embarrassing moments are functionally meaningless to observers, and if they cause us intense, unnecessary psychological and physical distress, why did human evolution select for this trait? Evolution typically weeds out processes that waste massive amounts of metabolic energy on false alarms. Why is this vulnerability hardwired into us?
And it isn't just a mental quirk. It's a visible, physical reaction. As Charles Darwin noted, blushing is the most uniquely human of all expressions. We don't see primates blushing. So what evolutionary advantage does turning bright red and feeling terrible give us?
To understand the evolutionary logic, we have to view embarrassment through the lens of game theory and cooperation. Early human survival relied on intricate networks of trust and reciprocal altruism.
You scratch my back, I scratch yours.
Exactly. But cooperative groups are always vulnerable to free riders, individuals who break the rules, steal resources, or defect on their obligations. A tribe desperately needs a mechanism to differentiate between a malicious free rider and an honest cooperator who simply made a mistake.
Ah, okay. If I drop the tribe's food supply, the group needs to know, did I do it because I'm careless and a threat to our survival? Or was it a genuine accident?
Precisely. And this is where the theory of costly signaling comes in. You can't just say, I'm sorry, because words are cheap. A psychopath can easily fake an apology. The tribe needs a signal that cannot be counterfeited. Embarrassment, and specifically the physiological blush, is an involuntary response driven by the autonomic nervous system. You cannot voluntarily force blood to dilate the capillaries in your cheeks.
Because it can't be faked. It's honest data.
It is the ultimate credible signal. The blush communicates, I recognize the social norm. I am aware I violated it. My distress proves I am invested in the group's hierarchy, and therefore I remain a safe partner for future cooperation.
So embarrassment isn't a punishment. It's an evolutionary peace offering.
Ex-
And the data from our sources backs this up in modern contexts, too. Studies show that when someone commits a faux pas and displays visible signs of embarrassment, like blushing, averting their gaze, or showing a pained smile, observers actually rate them as more trustworthy, more likable, and more pro-social than someone who commits the exact same error but remains totally stoic and unaffected.
Because the stoic person signals that they do not respect the group's norms, which is threatening. The blushing person signals submission to the group's norms, which builds affiliation.
That completely flips the script on how we view these moments. The embarrassment actually repairs the social damage the mistake created. But wait, if the blush repairs the social damage in the moment, why does the memory return at 3 a.m. 10 years later? What possible evolutionary benefit is there in re-experiencing the pain when the tribe has already forgiven me?
That brings us to what cognitive researchers call the rehearsal hypothesis. The brain isn't waking you up to torture you, it's waking you up to run an offline simulation.
An offline simulation.
Yeah. During sleep and quiet wakefulness, the brain consolidates memories. When an embarrassing memory surfaces, your brain is actively demanding that you analyze the variables of the failure. It wants to know, what specific micro-expression did I misread? What was the power dynamic in the room?
Here's where it gets really interesting. I was thinking about this like an elite athlete being forced by their coach to aggressively watch the game tape of their absolute worst performance. It is agonizing to watch yourself fumble the ball on tape over and over. But the coach isn't trying to make you miserable.
No, not at all.
The repeated exposure is a training mechanism. By replaying the specific mechanics of the failure, your brain is trying to write an updated behavioral protocol for the future.
That analogy maps perfectly onto the concept of memory reconsolidation. When you pull a memory out of storage at 3 a.m., it becomes briefly malleable. As you replay the cringe moment, you almost always involuntarily generate alternative scenarios, right?
Yeah, you think, oh, I should have just nodded or I should have stopped talking.
Your brain is literally neurochemically binding those corrected behavioral scripts to the original threat. It is upgrading your social intelligence so you don't repeat the error.
So my brain is essentially running defensive social drills, which makes perfect sense. But if we are so hyper-attuned to monitoring social failures to protect our own status, it naturally bleeds into how we observe other people. We don't just simulate our own failures, we actively seek out and consume the failures of others as a form of entertainment.
We do. The phenomenon of cringe culture is a massive psychological subfield right now. If the neural circuitry of embarrassment is so painful, why do millions of people voluntarily spend their time watching awkward talent show auditions, tone-deaf social media apologies, or just excruciating reality television?
There is an incredibly precise German word for this exact feeling, isn't there?
Yes, Frenchman.
Fremdschämen. It translates to feeling intense, proxy embarrassment on behalf of someone else, even if they aren't embarrassed themselves.
And neuroimaging reveals something fascinating about Fremdschämen. When you watch someone else humiliate themselves, your brain's mirror neuron system activates. Your own DACC, that same social pain center we talked about, lights up. You're literally simulating their pain.
Wow.
However, your prefrontal cortex simultaneously recognizes that you are not actually the one in danger, which dampens the amygdala's panic response.
So it's the psychological equivalent of a haunted house. You get the thrill of the threat without any of the actual danger. The sources break down this appetite for cringe into specific psychological mechanisms, and the first one they mention is downward social comparison.
Downward social comparison is deeply ingrained in human status seeking. When we observe someone else severely violating a social norm and tanking their own reputation, it provides a transient neurochemical reward. We get a minor dopamine hit because, relatively speaking, our own social status just became slightly more secure.
That's a little dark, but it makes sense.
It provides relief. The subconscious calculation is, well, I might have stumbled in my presentation today, but at least I'm not that guy destroying his career on the internet.
It's self-esteem by proxy. And that ties into the next mechanism, social norm reinforcement. By collectively cringing at someone, we are actively calibrating our own social compass.
Exactly. Social norms are invisible. You can't touch them. The only way a culture defines its boundaries is by observing what happens when someone crosses them. When an entire comment section collectively recoils at an awkward video, The group is implicitly negotiating and reinforcing the boundaries of acceptable behavior. It's a collective social immune response.
And sometimes we consume it not out of superiority, but out of a desperate need for recognition and relief. When we watch a comedian or a character do something universally awkward, like, pretending to text in a public space just to avoid making eye contact with an acquaintance,
Oh, everyone does that.
right? We laugh because we realize our own weird neuroses are shared.
It reduces the isolation of the human condition.
There is no better laboratory for this than Ricky Gervais's character, David Brent, in the original British version of The Office. It is a masterclass in weaponized Fremdschämen.
Oh, absolutely. The psychological architecture of David Brent is built entirely on the excruciating gap between his self-concept and social reality. He views himself as a charismatic, highly respected philosopher-entertainer. The audience, via the documentary camera, sees the brutal reality. He is desperately insecure, profoundly oblivious, and chronically inappropriate.
And the show forces us to sit in the tension of that gap. Viewers literally report experiencing physiological stress watching it, sweating, averting their eyes, or having to pause the show to walk around the room because the secondhand embarrassment is so overwhelming. But we always hit play again. Why?
Because that gap, the terrifying chasm between how we hope the world perceives us and how we are actually being perceived, is the core anxiety of the human condition. We watch David Brent fail to navigate that gap because it allows us to confront our own deepest social fears in a controlled environment. We cringe because his desperate need for validation is an uncomfortably distorted reflection of our own.
Now, we can all universally agree that David Brent doing a spontaneous, uncoordinated dance to impress his subordinates is objectively embarrassing. But what actually triggers the DACC pain response is heavily dependent on where you grew up. The rules of the cringe are not geographically universal.
That is a critical sociological nuance. The physiological response, the blush, the cortisol spike, is hardwired into the human genome. But the software that tells the system when to fire is culturally programmed. Cross-cultural psychology broadly categorizes these triggers by examining individualistic versus collectivistic societies.
But how does the cultural programming alter the trigger mechanism?
In individualistic cultures, such as the United States, Australia, or much of Western Europe, the predominant psychological framework is the independent self-control. Your identity is defined by your personal attributes, your personal achievements, and your personal autonomy.
Okay.
Therefore, embarrassment in these cultures is almost entirely triggered by personal exposure. You trip, you drop the ball, you forget the name. The spotlight is hyper-focused on the individual agent.
My failures belong to me, and my cringe belongs to me.
Exactly. But in collectivistic cultures, which encompass much of East Asia, Latin America, and parts of Africa and the Middle East, the dominant framework is the interdependent self-control. Your identity is fundamentally inextricably linked to your family, your community, or your corporation.
So the network.
Right. In these cultures, the boundary of what can trigger your personal embarrassment expands massively.
So my nervous system can be triggered by someone else's actions, not just as empathy, like Fremdschämen, but as a direct threat to my own status.
Precisely. The actions of a family member or a colleague reflect directly upon you. The research highlights the Japanese concept of haji, often translated as shame or embarrassment, but deeply intertwined with the concept of face, one's social standing, and the honor of the in-group.
Okay.
Losing face has a profoundly collective dimension. If a member of your team performs poorly, it isn't just their embarrassment. It is a shared failure that triggers a genuine internalized distress response in you.
This has massive real-world implications, especially for listeners who work in global environments. The source material gives a brilliant example of how these invisible cultural scripts can collide in a corporate setting. Let's say an American executive makes a noticeable arithmetic error during a major cross-cultural board meeting.
Okay. The American executive, operating under an individualistic script, will likely try to manage the awkwardness by deploying self-deprecating humor. They might say, well, clearly I need to go back to third-grade math. In an individualistic culture, this is a highly effective, high-status move. It signals confidence, humility, and the ability to not take oneself too seriously. The individualistic audience reads the signal and relaxes.
But the Japanese executives across the table, operating under the framework of haji and interdependent face, are reading a completely different set of subtitles.
To a colleague navigating the rules of faith, that self-deprecating joke does not rate as confident humility. It reads as a shocking lack of professional dignity and a failure to respect the gravity of the collective endeavor. The American thinks they are defusing a bomb, but the Japanese colleagues perceive the American as actively detonating their own credibility and, by extension, embarrassing the entire room.
It's a complete misfiring of the evolutionary peace offering. What works in Chicago totally fails in Tokyo. But despite these massive cultural variations in what triggers the emotion, the physiological endpoint, the blush, the urge to hide, remains a universal human constant.
It is the unifying thread. Whether you are cringing because you spilled coffee on yourself or because your subordinate misspoke, your brain is utilizing the exact same ancient neural pathways to keep you safely integrated into the social fabric.
Which is deeply fascinating from an anthropological perspective. But I want to bring this back to the listener lying in the dark at 3 a.m. Understanding the default mode network, the DACC, and the cultural frameworks is intellectually satisfying, sure, but it doesn't turn the adrenaline off.
No, it doesn't.
If my brain is running a faulty simulation and panicking over an event that nobody else remembers, how do I actually force quit the application? We need to look at how to rewire the cringe.
Cognitive behavioral therapy and modern psychology provide some highly effective, evidence-based protocols for short-circuiting this exact loop. The goal isn't to erase the memory, but to alter the emotional weight attached to it.
Walk us through the mechanics of that. How do we override the amygdala?
The most immediate tool is a cognitive reality check designed specifically to dismantle the spotlight effect. It utilizes a process called cognitive distancing. When the intrusive memory hits, your emotional brain is anchored in the first-person perspective. You are re-experiencing the heat and the panic. You have to force your prefrontal cortex to engage by running a 4-step analytical protocol.
Okay, give us step 1.
Step 1. Identify the literal audience. The amygdala tends to catastrophize and generalize, feeding you the feeling that everyone saw you fail. Force your declarative memory to state exactly who is in the room. Often you'll realize it wasn't an amorphous crowd, it was literally 3 specific people in a hallway. You immediately shrink the threat perimeter.
You move from a vague feeling of doom to concrete, manageable facts. Okay, step 2.
Step 2. Apply the spotlight correction factor. Whatever level of intense, burning humiliation you felt in that moment, actively recognize that this is an egocentric anchor. Consciously cut that perceived intensity in half, or even by 75%.
Because of the Gilovich study.
Exactly. Remind yourself that the observers were anchored in their own internal monologues. At maximum, they felt a passing flicker of mild amusement.
Step 3.
Step 3. Map the forgetting curve. Lean into the asymmetry of memory we discussed earlier. Because the event was not self-referential for the observers, their hippocampus did not consolidate the data. Explicitly remind yourself that unless the event materially impacted their lives, their memory of your stumble decayed within 24 to 48 hours. The audience you are terrified of literally does not possess the data anymore.
The jury doesn't even have the file. And step 4.
Step 4. The temporal distance test. Ask yourself, will this specific event have any material impact on my career, my relationships, or my physical safety 10 years from now? By projecting into the future, you force the brain to evaluate the actual survival threat. The answer is almost always a resounding no, which signals to the amygdala that it can stand down.
Shrink the audience, correct the spotlight, acknowledge the forgetting curve, and apply temporal distance. That is a brilliant mechanical override. But there's another approach detailed in our sources that attacks the problem from an emotional angle rather than a purely logical one. And that's the research pioneered by Dr. Kristen Neff on self-compassion.
The self-compassion research is vital because it addresses the secondary trauma of the embarrassing memory. The initial memory causes distress, but the bulk of our suffering comes from our immediate reaction to the memory. The default cognitive loop is intense self-criticism. The internal voice says, I am an absolute idiot. How could I be so stupid? I am uniquely broken.
Which just dumps more cortisol into the system. You are essentially attacking yourself.
You are sustaining the threat response. Dr. Neff's research demonstrates that self-criticism activates the body's threat defense system. Self-compassion, however, activates the mammalian caregiving system. It triggers the release of oxytocin and downregulates cortisol.
So what does this all mean in practice?
The protocol is shockingly simple but difficult to execute. When the memory hits, you must consciously treat yourself with the exact same emotional tone and verbal framing that you would instantly extend to a close friend.
I love that. If my best friend called me at 3 a.m. and said, I accidentally called the CEO honey in a meeting, I wouldn't scream at them. I wouldn't tell them they were worthless and their career was over. I would probably laugh warmly, validate their horror, and say, oh man, that is brutal. But honestly, people misspeak all the time. The CEO has probably already forgotten. You'll survive this.
And applying that to yourself is not delusion. It is not letting yourself off the hook or refusing to grow. Self-compassion is actually a far more accurate, empirically sound assessment of reality than your inner critic's catastrophizing. It is the objective recognition that you are a biological organism, operating with imperfect information, doing the best you can to navigate complex social structures. It frames the failure as a part of the shared human experience, rather than an isolating personal defect.
Which leads directly into the final and perhaps most powerful tool for neutralizing these memories, narrative reframing. You don't just forgive the memory, you change its structural format.
This relies on how the brain's language centers interact with emotional processing. A raw, unedited, embarrassing memory lives in the brain as a chaotic cluster of sensory data and implicit emotional threat. Narrative reframing is the conscious act of pulling that raw data into the prefrontal cortex and Broca's area and formatting it into a structured chronological story. You convert a trauma into an anecdote.
You take the raw terror of spilling wine on your boss, and you construct a beginning, a middle, and a punchline. You start saying, you want to hear the most ridiculously awkward thing I did today.
By doing that, you completely alter the power dynamic of the memory. When it's an intrusive thought, it is happening to you. When you script it into a story that you voluntarily tell others, you become the author. You reassert control over the data.
It's social alchemy. You take the very thing that was supposed to destroy your social standing, and you use it as currency to build connection. The most socially skilled people are almost always the ones who gleefully tell stories about their own catastrophic failures.
And mathematically, from an evolutionary standpoint, it is the ultimate costly signal. Voluntarily sharing your own embarrassment signals incredible social confidence. It tells the group, I am secure enough in my status to laugh at my own humanity, and I trust you enough to share my vulnerability. It is a profound mechanism for building rapport and psychological safety.
It turns the weapon into a bridge. We've traced the anatomy of the cringe from the overlapping pain centers in the DACC through the evolutionary game theory of the blush to the cultural programming of the spotlight effect. But it brings us to one final realization.
This raises an important question. What is this entire neurological apparatus fundamentally built to protect? If embarrassment is an alarm system, what is the valuable asset it is guarding?
It's guarding our values.
Exactly. Embarrassment functions as a high-fidelity compass pointing directly toward what you care about most. If you lie awake fringing over a poorly delivered presentation, it is only because you deeply value professional competence and contributing to your team. If you cringe because you made a thoughtless comment that hurt a friend, it is because you fundamentally value empathy, connection, and kindness. You cannot feel embarrassment over something you are truly indifferent to.
The cringe is the proof of your values, which highlights something deeply unsettling about the alternative. When we are trapped in the 3 a.m. ambush, the ultimate fantasy is to be cured. We wish we could permanently sever the DACC connection. We wish we could just be entirely immune to embarrassment, to walk through life totally bulletproof to social judgment.
But the clinical literature shows us exactly what that immune state looks like, and it is a massive red flag. Individuals who lack the capacity for embarrassment, who never experience a physiological cringe response when they violate a social norm, are often exhibiting traits of psychopathy or profound antisocial personality disorders. They do not blush because they genuinely do not care how their actions impact the internal worlds of others.
They are blind to the social fabric. So the very fact that you are suffering in bed over a minor social failure is the ironclad neurological proof that you are a highly functional, deeply empathetic human being. You are connected.
The system is working exactly as it should. The alarm is loud, but it only rings because you are invested in the people around you.
So, to everyone listening to this right now, I want to say this directly. The audience you are terrified of does not exist. Your most mortifying moment, the one that makes your stomach drop when you think about it, is a ghost. To everyone else on the planet, it was merely background noise that faded years ago. By any fair, objective measure, you are doing absolutely fine.
The threat is an illusion. You survived the exposure.
You survived. And so I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over as you navigate your next awkward encounter. If the intense burning discomfort of embarrassment is simply the biological tax we pay for possessing empathy, self-awareness, and the desire to be a good partner to our fellow humans, then maybe we need to completely reframe how we view it. The next time you feel that sudden paralyzing jolt of a memory at 3 a.m., or you feel that hot blush creeping up your neck in a crowded room, instead of trying to run from it, what if you viewed it as the ultimate, undeniable proof of your own humanity? Because maybe the only thing truly worth being embarrassed about is never being capable of feeling embarrassed at all.